Trade, while it's lifted so many millions of people out of poverty and plays a critical role in development.
Welcome to Trade Finance Talks, your go-to trade, treasury and payments podcast, brought to you by TFG. I'm Deepesh Patel, editor at Trade Finance Global. Today we're in Seoul, Korea, at the 56th annual meeting of FCI, the Global Association for Facilitating Open Account and Receivables Finance. Today I'm joined by a very regular contributor of TFG who you all may know very well, discussing the role of multilateral development banks in facilitating trade and supply chain finance. We're also going to discuss how they've evolved and what the focus for trade finance should be in a changing world in order to promote resiliency in supply chains, gaps in financing, addressing fraud and reducing poverty. You guessed it right, it's Steven Beck, Head of Trade and Supply Chain Finance at the Asian Development Bank. Steven, welcome to Trade Finance Talks.
Thank you very much for having me back, Deepesh.
Always. And look, Steven, let's get this out of the way. It's a warm-up question. You'll see why. I'm very curious to find out about your exercise regime. I spotted you in the hotel gym this morning. Can you tell me what your gym routine is?
Well, as we were discussing, Deepesh, before we started this interview, without exercise, I'll be even more crazy and manic. It's just so important for me mentally to get that sort of energy out and get that sort of exercise buzz to be able to. So yeah, exercise is really important to me, and I do typically 30 minutes of cardio and then some light weights.
Thank you very much. And yeah, exercise is extremely important. And if Steven Beck can do it, then you can do it too. You're actually one of the first people I interviewed back in May 2019. And actually, I want us to go back even further in time to, I think, approximately 50 years ago. I want to talk to you about the rise and then the evolution of multilateral development banks, but specifically with that trade and supply chain finance angle. How did development banks really evolve post-Soviet times? And what was the role of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development in Europe and also in Japan?
I don't claim to be an expert in the history of MDBs, but yeah, I mean, the first multilateral development bank was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is now commonly known as the World Bank. And it was created in 1944 to help a devastated Europe and Japan rebuild after the Second World War. Since the World Bank was created, governments come together to create other multilateral development banks, including the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development was created in the 90s to help former Soviet countries develop. There was a concern that they might fall back into communism, and the shareholder governments that created the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, wanted to ensure that these countries went forward democratically in terms of capitalism. So it's interesting. Obviously, sort of going back to the World Bank, it started with Europe and Japan, and then, of course, the mandate changed to be global.
That's an important history lesson. And I guess the shareholders of multilateral development banks are ultimately governments, and they need to agree on specific goals. Can you talk about some of those key goals that come to agreement by those shareholders?
Yeah. So as you say, Deepesh, I mean, multilateral development banks they're not profit maximizing, right? So in a commercial institution, depending on how much money you make, you can determine how successful you are. But in a multilateral development bank, where the mandate is development, to improve people's lives, to drive prosperity, that can be a lot more difficult, right? Particularly today where sustainable development, how does one define that, etc. They're all very sort of interesting discussions. And the development metrics, the corporate results frameworks are hotly debated. And in fact, Asian Development Bank is now in the process of developing a new corporate results framework. So it's some very interesting questions. And Asian Development Bank, which has 68 shareholder governments now, was created in 1966. Like other multilateral development banks, ADB is AAA rated and has a mandate to support the reduction of poverty and development.
I want to talk about that. You talked about supporting the commercial sector or the private sector, and we hear a lot about the Asian Development Bank supporting private sector. Can you talk a little bit more about this? Because I know the history of many of the development banks, they used to support large infrastructure projects. Has that changed, and if so, how?
Yeah, exactly, Deepesh. Traditionally, these multilateral development banks focused exclusively on big loans to governments for infrastructure and budget support. Over time, multilateral development banks realized that the private sector has a very important role to play in development, arguably even more important than governments.
It's all about how trade can help contribute to the growth of economies. And I guess it's probably a good news story for Korea, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if we look at the impact of trade certainly in Korea, a country that's gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest countries in the world within one generation, and the role that trade played in that development, it's amazing. And you also see that throughout Asia, trade has lifted millions of people out of poverty. In the sort of progression of multilateral development banks, the trade finance programs really came into being in the wake of the global financial crisis. That's when these programs started. In fact, the first one was at EBRD. I think the second was at ADB and then IFC and so on.
Hey, enjoying this podcast? Hit that follow button for more. Done? Let's get back to it. Let's talk about trade and supply chain finance, because I think they've been on a bit of a roller coaster journey even before the pandemic. How is Asian Development Bank implementing strategies to address some of the challenges that we've seen? Perhaps you can talk about some of the challenges before, during the pandemic, and right now today.
Yeah, Deepesh, it's an interesting question because trade, while it's lifted so many millions of people out of poverty and plays a critical role in development, it has its issues, right? And its detractors will point out that, for example, trade and its supply chains are responsible for at least 25% of the global carbon footprint. So if we don't green trade and supply chains, we're not going to reach our climate targets. People will also say that there's a lack of transparency in trade, and it accounts for a lot of trade-based money laundering that supports crime and terrorism. And so we need to do a much better job of driving transparency in trade and supply chains. We need to make trade much more inclusive. A lot of people are excluded from trade. A lot of SMEs and individuals don't benefit from trade. So we need to maximize the development potential from trade by ensuring that more people are included in the benefits. And there are other issues, Deepesh, including labor standards throughout supply chains that we also need to address. And finally, there's resilience. I mean, you look at before the pandemic, maybe there was some degree of consciousness about a lack of resilience or fragility in supply chains. But certainly during the pandemic and after, we're very conscious of just how important it is to ensure that supply chains and global trade is resilient, because we need critical goods when and where they're required. And if we don't get them, there's going to be real suffering.
I must say credit to ADB during the pandemic, the number of digital tools and initiatives that you launched to try and ensure that trade kind of continues. But I think it's really important to show light on the darker side of trade, the unintended consequences. But let's actually talk about the light stuff, or rather the exciting new developments of trade and some of the exciting initiatives around trade digitalization. Can you perhaps talk about why you're so excited about aligning things like the model law on electronic transferable records, or MLETR? Why is that important for ADB?
If we can digitalize trade, which is now a totally antiquated process involving mountains and mountains of paper, if we can take that paper and transfer it into data, it would be transformative. And it would really help us tackle a lot of these issues that I mentioned earlier, the shortcomings of trade, whether it's inclusion or being able to drive transparency, resilience, and even build or layer on top of digitalization an ability to better monitor environmental and labor standards throughout trade and its supply chains. Digitalization of trade has to be arguably our most important
top priority.
Yeah, our most important goal. So how do we achieve that? We achieve it by agreeing in the trade ecosystem among exporters, shipping, ports, customs, warehousing, logistics, importers on the electronic form of those paper documents that we now use in trade. So we need to digitalize those 30 or 40 documents that are used mostly in trade. And the second thing is we need governments to recognize into law those electronic documents. And that's where this model law for transferable records, MLETR, comes in. It's a UN model law that we've been encouraging governments to align their domestic legislation to. So it's those two things that are really going to move the digitalization agenda. We've brought together other MDBs to create an MDB working group to ramp up this work. We're in the process of deciding which countries we each take, which trade corridors we take responsibility for in driving this leader issue. So critical, and we're very excited about moving that much more quickly.
We've discussed everything from gym routines and the importance of exercise to the digitalization of trade and how that actually helps look at some of the challenges that trade faces right now, and also the dark side of trade, some of those unintended consequences and the evolving role that multilateral development banks play in facilitating that change. Steven, thank you for joining us at Trade Finance Talks here at FCI Seoul, their 56th annual meeting.
Many thanks, Deepesh.